I think a lot of the problems we've seen is when politicians do things that look like they're in isolation and targeted at special groups. So winter fuel payments, what happened there? Pensioners felt targeted. IHT on farmers, what happened there? Farmers felt targeted. The recent welfare reforms, disabled people felt targeted. And it all felt very specific and very targeted at a specific group. And there was no real sense of what's the sunny up plans here? What's the vision?
Hello and welcome to another edition of the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And today is, for me at least, a very special edition of the IFS Zooms In because it's the last one I will be hosting. I'm leaving the directorship of the IFS in the next few days, taking a bit of a holiday and then going on to a new life as Provost of Queen's College, Oxford. Though I do hope that my guest today will invite me back occasionally to appear as a guest, because my guest today is my successor as the director of the IFS. It's Helen Miller, who is currently, until next week, deputy director here, has been running our tax work for getting on for a decade now, and has been at the IFS for even longer than I've been director, actually. She's been at the IFS since 2007, and I'm absolutely delighted to say that she'll be taking over not just as director of the IFS, but as the host of the IFS Zooms In. So you'll get to hear a different voice from now on. Helen, welcome.
Thank you. Hello.
So we're going to step back a bit and not talk about what might happen in the budget in a few months' time or the precise state of the public finances at the moment, but where we are in terms of growth, where we are in terms of people's incomes, where we are in terms of the public finances over the next few years. And Helen, let's start with that question of growth. I think it's really worth us talking about why growth is so important, because I've read some fairly extraordinary stuff in some serious newspapers recently saying that growth isn't something that we should be aiming for, isn't terribly important. And there is quite a group of people on the left, on the green end of politics and elsewhere, who have made the argument that growth is actually not that important, not what we should be aiming for. And it's a very plausible argument. What we should be aiming for is well-being, welfare, social mobility, environmental sustainability, and all those sorts of things. And let me be clear, listeners, I believe all of those things are important. But Helen, we think growth is actually a really important thing to aim for.
I agree. We think that growth is a really important thing to aim for.
Tell us why.
Okay, so maybe a little bit of context first as well. I mean, interesting you mentioned 2007 when I joined IFS. I mean, when I joined,
the economy was going fine when you joined.
Well, it was, yeah. I remember I joined and I read all my green budget chapters to swat up. And it just became the norm that everything got better. People's incomes rose and the economy grew. And, it all seemed kind of easy. And then the financial crisis happened and that was bad. And everyone knew that was bad. But for a long time, everyone thought, but it'll get better and it'll be okay. And productivity will bounce back. Productivity being the amount that each person can produce. And it just took an extraordinary amount of time just to get back to where we were, when I joined IFS. And since then, growth has just been really sluggish. So the reason I'm putting that context there is that why does that matter? Well, one of the things that felt really true, obviously true when I joined the IFS, that things got better, wages rose, incomes were going up. You just haven't seen that, right? I know you've got a nice slide you like showing people about it being the worst period for wages since Napoleon or something. But the serious point being that we just, living standards have been doing actually pretty badly, right? So in a very direct sense, just the kind of, if only for we got used to the history of people getting better off, and that has stopped happening, and people are noticing that it's stopped happening. So I think that direct link to living standards is one reason it matters. I'm sort of starting with some practical reasons, which goes to philosophical reason. It might matter in a minute, but
that's a pretty important practical reason. If you don't have growth in the economy, people don't get better off, and if you don't have growth, people feel it. The next generation isn't better off than the generation before it. And wealth becomes much more important relative to income as well.
Yeah, exactly. And it's on that, we'll start that. I mean, I was given a talk the other day, actually, and I was saying to people what we're saying now, that growth is important. And I was saying that I think growth should be the government's number one mission. It should be the thing that, we're throwing the kitchen sink at. And somebody in the audience asked me, in completely good faith, why that was true. And basically said, well, hang on, we're already a rich country. We've got high living standards relative to lots of other things, relative to history. Why isn't it enough? Why don't we just deal with what we've got? And maybe we can unpack that a little bit. But I think part of it is that I'm not sure people would be happy with that. even if we
Well,
said...
we know they're not. I mean,
Yeah.
look how unhappy people are.
Yeah, exactly. And to say that actually we've got enough now and that maybe there are medical innovations coming down the track, for example, but no, you can't have them because we've got enough already. And maybe you could have a nicer house, or you could have more leisure time, or you could have, more general entertainment, more happiness in some sense. But no, you've got enough. I don't think that's actually, for most people, a very compelling narrative. I mean, perhaps worth saying, a bit like you said at the top, there clearly are things that we wouldn't do to get growth. I mean, if you started saying, let's put all children into the workforce to drive up growth, we would say no, right? There are constraints, obviously, on what we would do to get growth. There are some forms of things that would drive up growth that we would say are not a good idea. But in general, the idea that, progress happens, that people can get better off. And again, not just in the material sense. You might want more, coffees or furniture or clothes, but more importantly is welfare, right? You might just actually want to spend less of your time working and have more free time. You might want to spend more of your time being entertained by something, or it's not just about more material stuff, right? Growth isn't just about material stuff. It's about more freedom to do the things that you enjoy in a much broader sense than just stuff.
And we know that, what allowed the development of the welfare state, what allowed us to spend so much on health and pensions and so on, it's the fact that the economy grew. The economy was bigger, so the government could take money from us and redistribute it to us, but we were still getting better off, even as the government took more money from us. And you can see this very, very clearly, actually, in the data. In the 2000s, there was lots of growth, and the government took more money from people and redistributed it to people on low incomes. And that went into reverse in the 2010s as growth went into reverse. Actually, take the environment. I mean, how are we going to get to net zero without making people better off, worse off rather, in a way that they really resent? Well, it's much, much harder to do that if you don't have growth, because if you don't have growth and you're taking money to get there, again, you make people worse off. And we know that economies that are thriving more invest more in environmental protection. It's poor economies, people who, when you really need the resources, that chop down forests, as we chopped down forests in this country hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So all of these things are important. And the one thing that really gets me actually is this importance of giving people a chance in life. If there's no growth, if the economy is stagnant, then there's no more room at the top. So there's no more well-paid jobs. So people work really hard to make sure their kids get the well-paid jobs. And we see that again. Social mobility has declined as growth has declined. And your parents' wealth becomes more and more important to your long-term living standards. And one not very useful piece of advice I give to lots of kids is choose your parents, because it's become more and more and more important who your parents are because we haven't had growth.
And that, it's worth dwelling on that. That is really depressing, right? Again, I remember
really
joining the IFS and partly just feeling like, oh my God, I've made it. I've got a great job, and this is going to be great. But it was true at that time that I could have reasonably expected that my lifetime earnings would have been, more important. And I now see the data that, people like you have been working on the Deaton review, and it's depressing that it's going to matter less for generations, that how much work they do or how great they are. It's going to just matter more that you were born into a certain place, and that is really grim in a society-wide sense.
Well, here at the Update, IFS zooms in, but on the upside, maybe we will get. These are all the reasons why I think it's actually desperately important that we do more to get growth. And to be fair to this government, it really talks a good game on that. It has been saying that growth is the thing that it's really aiming for. It is doing some things which will help that, we hope, in the long run. More investment, reform to the planning system, at least talk about better regulation and so on. It's not obvious, and we won't go into the details here. It's not obvious they've done the best things in the short term. They've increased taxes on employers, actually increased quite a lot of regulation and so on. But let's say we think their heart's in the right place.
But it's also, on that, it's perhaps also worth spelling out for people why it's so important within the public finance. We talked about the living standards and what matters for society in general, but actually almost just more mechanically for the public finances. One thing that's happened, again, while I've been at IFS, is that the amount of debt the country has gone up a lot, and the reasons you want to manage that. And I'm simplifying, but if you think of a nominal amount of debt divided by the size of the economy. If the economy is growing faster, that debt becomes just mechanically easier to manage. Painting with a very broad brush, it used to be the case that we had these strong growth rates, and therefore debt was just easier to manage because over time, debt became smaller relative to the size of this growing economy. What we've seen more recently is that because that's not happening, because the economy is not growing very strongly, therefore that debt doesn't get eroded away by growth. This big stock of debt just sits there, and the big price tag that comes with it keeps needing to be paid. So I think, from just a more practical point of view, rather than think about having to pay that debt off, pound by pound, which is extremely painful because who wants to spend, what are we spending now, 100 billion on debt interest?
More than 100 billion, yeah.
Yeah. That's not doctors and nurses and fun stuff, is it? That's just, no one wants to be paying that. But the idea of paying down the debt stock like that is terrifying. What we need is a bigger economy so that debt becomes more manageable.
That's exactly right. And I was talking to someone just now who was saying, well, how did this work after the Second World War when we had a lot more debt than we do now? And a big part of the answer is we had really quite fast nominal growth in the economy, which meant that the value of the pile of debt relative to national income fell quite quickly. But that was a lovely segue into the other thing. One of the other things I want to talk about, Helen, which is the state of the public finances and the challenges that's going to pose, not this year, though it is going to pose some challenges this year, but more broadly into the longer term. And to summarise, and we've got this horrible situation. We've got low levels of growth and low levels of expected growth. We've got high levels of debt, quite high interest rates, and already a tax burden, which is at the highest it's ever been. And I think one of the things is the Chancellor's got these fiscal rules, and lots of people are saying, look, these are made-up rules. We can break them. We could borrow some more. Everything will be fine. But I think my concern is more that actually these fiscal rules are not very tight. Debt is not falling. It's nearly 100% of national income. We borrowed £150 billion last year. So this is not a world in which we're being very tight. And look into the longer term and, cheery again. Everything just looks harder. Yeah,
I think in some ways we've lost a bit of the trees, not we, IFS, the broader public debate, kind of lost the trees for the wood with fiscal rules in the sense that, what's the government really trying to do? What should they be trying to do is manage the economy and the public finances in a sensible way. So not having an ever increasing debt burden that gets out of control. And fiscal rules are something you can put in place to try to constrain yourself and try to tie your own hands and to signal to the markets and everybody else the kind of stance you want to take. They shouldn't be seen as the maximum you could do. They're kind of like, so Rachel Reeves loosened the fiscal rule around debt, right? She targets a new measure of debt. So worth saying to listeners, the measure of debt that for years the government was targeting and saying we want to get down, is not going. It's now increasing, right? So we've now, that old measure of debt that we were worried about for years is now going up. The measure of debt they're currently targeting is not really going down, is it? I mean, no, you can squint at the chart and it maybe goes down by a pixel, but it's
it's flat.
It's basically
at best,
flat.
Yes.
So people ask, well, could the government borrow more? And in some sense, yes. If the government wanted to go to the market and borrow another 5-10 billion, could they? Yes, at a price. Everything you can do at a price. The question is not could they, it's should they. Should they keep borrowing more and more and more money and adding to the cost of that? I think there's a good answer to say at some point, no. At some point, you can't just keep adding to this debt. And I worry that we have the fiscal rules and can say, well, can you do more than the fiscal rules? Well, yes. Again, doesn't mean you should. I was trying to think this morning on the train about analogies to help the people who aren't seeped in this stuff the way that we are. And I think it's a bit like, let me try this out and you can tell me if it's silly. It's a bit like somebody saying, I'm currently overweight and I want to lose weight over some time period, a couple of years, and saying, therefore, as a rule, I'm never going to eat more than I burn in a given day. That's a good rule. It doesn't mean that you should eat exactly what you burn every day. You're never going to lose weight that way, right? You're going to stable. And in some ways, the government's doing something even worse. It's saying, well, in a few years' time, I will start exercising more than I eat, I promise. But for today, I'm eating cake. And it's like, if you do that, and at every point you just say, today's always a day for cake and tomorrow's always a day for exercise, it's kind of no one's surprised that you stay fat, right? So I think it is about we shouldn't just ask, does the fiscal rule allow it? That's a metric we can think of, and I'm not saying we should get rid of fiscal rules, but it's not enough. I think we need a broader debate about how much we're borrowing, why are we borrowing, what are we borrowing for, or are we always borrowing for the right reasons?
Oh dear, I'm now going to have pictures in my head of great big fat economists or chancellors or something every time I think about the public debt. But, and there's a cost to all this, which as we discussed earlier, which is that we are spending a very large amount of money on debt interest at the moment. Something like £110 billion, about double the entire defence budget. More than we spend on any public service other than the National Health Service. And that doesn't make anyone happy, because we actually have to run, in order to stop the debt rising, we actually have to run what's called a primary surplus. In other words, we need to raise more in tax and other sources of revenue than we spend on everything other than those debt interest payments. When I go on social media to say this, I get a lot of responses along the lines of, "Don't be ridiculous, Johnson. This is a country that prints its own currency. A country that prints its own currency can't run out of money. Of course we can borrow more. And in fact, taxes are not really about raising money to spend at all. We print our own money. We can do whatever we like."
Modern monetary theory.
Modern monetary theory. I mean, now there are more and less respectable versions of this, but a lot of people on sort of social media take what I think is a rather unrespectable version of this and basically say, we're a sovereign state, we can borrow what we want. Now, in some sense, it's obvious that this is nonsense. I mean, there have been people selling this kind of snake oil throughout history, and there are countries around the world littered with examples of where people have tried to pretend that there are no constraints. And in fact, the whole study of economics is about constraints. But perhaps you could just talk us through a little bit why this doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There are lots of different versions of this argument. So, in some sense, it depends a bit on which version you were having a go at. So, rather than try to go through the different ones, I'm not sure I remember all exactly the nuances of the different versions of it. I mean, one thing to remember is that people are lending the government money. They're not obliged to do that. It is a choice they make. So the government can say, I want to borrow more money, and people can say yes or no. And at the extreme, they might just start saying no. And that has happened in history, where people have not been willing to lend governments more money because it's basically a stupid investment, because you're not going to get your money back. But even before you get to that, what I think was a very extreme position, what people absolutely can do is demand a higher interest rate. And there's nothing freaky about that, right? People want more money in return for lending you money. And like we were just talking about, that comes at a cost. So there's no escaping that in some sense. So again, could you borrow more money? Yes, but it's expensive. And therefore, do you want to borrow more money rather than borrow more money, meaning you have to pay it back in future, potentially at a higher cost, rather than just raise the money today, pay for it today through taxes, and not have to bear that other cost. So I think that, in some basic sense, there's no free lunch where nobody pays for this in the world, right?
Exactly.
Services are being purchased, wages are being paid, somebody is paying money, and therefore it's either the case that it's you raise tax revenue, you hand the money over to services, or somebody lends you the money and you pay them back. There's nothing. There's no magic there.
What about printing the money?
In the UK, we have an independent bank, central bank, which I think is a good thing. But ignoring the kind of institutional features of that, just the principle of, could the government just print loads of money? Yes. What you're going to do is drop prices and get inflation. So you can just helicopter drop money into the country, or however you want to do it, send it in checks, and everyone goes out and tries to spend that money. What do the people who are selling stuff do? They haven't suddenly got more stuff to sell.
Exactly.
They put up their prices. And are you better off if you have £100 and the prices go up? No. So in that, again, it's an illusion. It's an illusion that you can just print money to spend. I mean, if I just give you £100, obviously you're better off. If we all get £100 extra, and we all spend that maybe £100 is not enough, but you get a big extra increase in money, you're just going to have higher prices. And we care about real things, not nominal things.
Well, I'm waiting for my £100 at the end of the podcast, but that's
it's a leaving gift.
That's exactly the point, isn't it? That there are real constraints in the economy. Just creating more money. If you're in some kinds of recession, printing more money can help to get the economy going. But when you're not in a recession, printing money, just creating money, doesn't create anything real. It just results in, it will in the end simply result in higher prices. There is no, you have to work hard to get the growth that we've had, to get the productivity that we've got, to get the living standards that we have. You couldn't have just sort of sat there 200 years ago and printed a bunch of money. You actually had to invent steam engines and all of these things.
Another way to simplify this right down to the bone in some sense is think about, we don't have a bartering economy now. We have money makes things easier in lots of different ways, because I haven't got to, swap economic services with the plumber to get my plumbing services.
It's fortunate. I don't think many plumbers who do that.
I think we'd be struggling if we did that. But the point being that fundamentally, it's still, there are people in the world who are trading things with each other, and you have to give up some of your time to create something somebody else wants, and they do the same thing. And you can, because of this great thing we have called borrowing, trade with people in the future, or you can trade over time. So we have a very complex financial system, but there's no getting around the fact that it's still, we are trading with each other and buying services, and there's no kind of manna from heaven magic thing that lets you get stuff without somebody having to trade for that in some sense.
Yeah, and in the end, someone has to pay. And one of the things I think we face as a democracy is that we don't today want to pay for things that we want to have today. So we want higher welfare payments, we want higher pensions, we want more money on the NHS and so on. But we balk at the idea of paying the tax for that, and that's one of the reasons why our debt pile has got so high, and we're spending a lot on debt interest. And we've seen again in very recent days and weeks, Labour MPs, the electorate, being very unhappy about making cuts, and that is probably going to result in the Chancellor having to do something on the tax side in a few months, time, and that debt, it genuinely is in the end a burden on future generations. And indeed, we are now a generation that is paying the cost of the debt that was that was accumulated over a long period of time.
Well, but on that, just quickly, it's worth pointing out. It was obviously true that there's a big debt. We're not going to pay down debt for a long time. But actually, think about the last few years. Things have changed pretty quickly, right? The debt pile went up very quickly. And the debt interest bill went up very quickly. So we are paying today the stuff we did 3 or 4 years ago. We're not talking about, our great grandkids and what they're going to have to do. It's partly about them, but you haven't actually got to wait very, very long for some of these things to come home to roost, right? This is not some really philosophical thing about, well, do I want people in 200 years to be? This is much shorter time frame than that we're potentially talking about here.
It's hitting us today, and it's hit us because interest rates for a decade were close to zero, and now they're much, much higher than that. So this is a cheery podcast. Let's look a little bit more at some of the challenges facing us down the road then. So one thing that helps pay down the debt is if things are if things are getting cheaper, if there are things that we don't have to spend anymore. And if you look again after the Second World War, we dramatically cut spending on defence, for example, or if demography is with you. Again, we had a baby boom population who were growing up into the labour market and a relatively small pensioner population. I think listeners, what's coming next. That's not the world we face over the next couple of decades, is it?
Nope.
Nope.
So many of our regular followers will have seen us, lots of us having the peace dividend chart, where basically showing that for decades, the government was cutting defence spending and there was rising health spending, and therefore you basically could have more health spending without a shrinking state, without a growing state, sorry. And that's clearly not the world we're in now, because this government, and I suspect governments for a little while, are going to be trying to increase defence and health at the same time. And on the ageing, interestingly, we at IFS been saying for a long time that ageing is coming down the track and it's going to happen. But if you look at like a measure of how many older people there are relative to the working age population, it's actually been pretty flat up until about now.
Yeah. So the number of pensioners relative to the working age population, partly because pension ages have risen.
Sure. But if you think about pensioners being the people who aren't in the workforce and therefore not paying as much tax as people in the workforce, and people in the workforce as being the ones that are paying the tax in some sense, then that ratio is changing, and it's going to increase basically, which isn't necessarily good or bad. It's just a kind of a fact of life in some sense. But we have a system that's not geared to that. We have a system that, I'm painting with a very broad brush, obviously, but you have children that are costs in some sense, and then you have people in their working life. We put most taxes on people in their working life, and then people retire. And we have one myth that I kind of can't help shoving in here at the kind is that people have paid in during their working life for their state pension. They're going to draw their state pension. That's not true. The national insurance contribution is not hypothecated tax. You weren't paying into any kind of pot. The working age population now is paying taxes, and that's paying for current state pensions. And that was all kind of well and good when the working age population was the growing one. It was the big one. It's just a bit harder to manage when you've got, both when you've got to transition to a different demography, because you can change things, but not overnight. And when you've got the sort of the big tax-paying population getting smaller relative to the pensioner population. Now, not just that, I should point out, if anyone's screaming at me, obviously pensioners pay tax, all sorts of taxes. But if you think some of our two biggest taxes, income tax and national insurance, are on incomes, obviously, and most people earn most of their income in working life. So there's a pressure going on there.
Yeah, and as you have more people over state pension age, obviously pay more on pensions, but we'll also be paying more for health. I mean, actually, demography is not the biggest driver of health spending, but it's a driver, and we demand more and better health. And why wouldn't we? I mean, as I've said, I suspect on this podcast a couple of times, there's no point in getting richer if you're sick or dead. So it's not surprising we want to spend more money on health, particularly as we get better at providing it. And then there's social care as well, which, this government's kicked that can down the road, as have all previous governments, but it's still going to cost us more money.
And I think I'm right in saying just on that on the cost of healthcare, that actually a lot of the costs of healthcare are really right at the end of life. There's a kind of a
substantial chunk.
It's,
So not necessarily partly it's to do with if you've got a population that's aging in part because you can cure some diseases and then people live a bit longer, whereas previously you couldn't cure those diseases, then the amount you need to spend over someone's life actually rises. A good thing, but it's going to cost us more. And then you've got the Prime Minister recently promising another 30 billion on defence spending. Now, whether that promise will ever come to pass, I don't know. The things that are said in these international meetings certainly don't always come to pass. I was in the Treasury in the mid-2000s when the government agreed, lots of governments agreed to spend 0.7% of national income on overseas aid. The UK was one of very few governments that actually made the attempt to do that, and now has entirely resiled from it and reduced overseas aid to its lowest level in probably more than half a century. So will defence spending actually go up 3.5% of national income? I don't know, but it's certainly not going to go down. It will probably go up a bit. So you've got ageing, you've got health, you've got defence. All of these things are pushing the bills up into the next decades, and we're going into those decades with high levels of debt, high levels of debt interest, and so on, and an unwillingness, as we've described, to either pay more tax or make any cutbacks on some of these spending plans. Also,
it may be worth reminding people as well that there are the things that we know are coming. So, we can look at the population projections. These are the known knowns. Yeah, but we also, shocks come along, right? So
these are the known unknowns.
Not exactly, thank you. Love the value add. But seriously, I think for a long time there was a bit of a narrative around, we've got rid of the boom and bust, things are going to be okay. And so not only do the shocks come along, but also it seems like the government, at least if COVID's an example, government decided, and it was a choice, to respond to that pretty generously, right? So, it spent a lot of money in those shocks trying to ensure. Now, I'm not saying it should or shouldn't have done that, but there was a world. I think some other governments did this, which the government could have done less to ensure people against those bad times, and actually basically let living standards fall further in those shocks. So not only that shocks could come along, but also I think we've become more accustomed. I could be wrong about this, but I think we're becoming more accustomed to the idea that government's going to step in and ensure those periods when bad things happen, and therefore that's also. We should know those things are coming, even if we don't know the specifics. We should have some buffer against knowing that something will happen. Things won't be as good as we expected them to. We need to have the scope in those moments to do something about them, and not assume that everything's going to be okay now and we can just foresee everything.
I think that I think the political take on that sort of idea was you should fix the roof when the sun is shining. Now, I don't say that as a support to any one type of political party or approach. But I think, again, coming back to the structure of the fiscal rules, at the moment, We're not putting any more holes in the roof, arguably, but we're certainly not fixing it. So that the sun may not be shining very brightly, but it is shining in the sense that we're not.
Could be cloudier.
It could be a lot cloudier. We're not in the middle of a storm at the moment. We're just in the middle of a sort of long period of gloom, shall we say?
Like the British weather, just standard British weather.
I'm afraid it is, and it has become the rather standard British economic climate as well over this period.
But I think both of those things point to governments needing to do things now, right? So we're going to be, the big public debate will be laser focused on the budget and what to do in the short run. But actually, because there might be shocks coming along, we should think about those. But also we know that ageing is going to happen, and we know that we're going to need to do things to meet net zero. We should be thinking now about what those things.
So what should they be? Go on, Helen. Give me the answer now that I'm just leaving.
Well, let me just pick. So let me pick on one on net. We come back to aging on net zero, just because I think it's one that the government should be embarrassed about, actually, and I think actually all pods should be embarrassed about not having an answer to. Is the specifics always matter. So just take net zero. We're planning to move away from internal combustion engine cars. The government actually gets quite a chunk of money currently from taxing fuel and taxing cars.
About a good 30 billion.
So I think all motoring tax is 40 plus.
That, yeah.
Now we're already, as regular listeners will know, in this ridiculous situation where every year the Chancellor says, I'm going to put up fuel duty in line with inflation next year, I promise. And the OBR say, okay, and they put it in their forecast. And the time comes, they say, no, not this year, next year. So there's already there's that silliness built into the fiscal forecast.
We've had 15 years of that now.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a silliness. But more importantly than just the sort of the silliness of the forecasting of that is stepping back. We all see that revenue declining, right? Not just because the policymakers aren't willing to raise it with inflation, but because we're trying to move away from the tax. We're trying to get rid of the tax base in some sense. So where is the plan for how we replace that 40 billion, whatever the number is, big numbers of billions? If there's a plan, it's tucked away somewhere. I haven't seen it. Also, there's still a reason to tax cars. Even if we do move entirely to electric vehicles, they create congestion. There's still a reason to tax that congestion. But waiting until the tax base has gone from fuel and then saying, oh, now we want to start taxing electric cars is obviously a silly way to do things. Much easier to transition more smoothly. But no plan around that. So, and that's just one area. That's without thinking about all the other things you might need to do to decarbonise. But they're the kind of detailed areas of policy where we need to be thinking about this, right? And that one we know the answer in some sense. We should just start finding ways to either tax congestion directly and or starting putting taxes on electric cars.
Or at least tax you on the number of miles driven, which is broadly what taxing petrol does. And technology is now such that would be really very easy. I mean, again, we actually did some work on this in the Treasury 20 years ago, when it'd be much harder because you didn't have all of everyone sort of wandering around with a sort of satellite, effectively receiver in their car or on their phone. And you're right. I mean, we will lose that all of that revenue from petrol taxes over the next few years. And the problem here is the problem of the politics as well, isn't it? The problem of how do you achieve this when people have already. I mean, electric cars are, what are they, a quarter perhaps, or perhaps more than a quarter of. There's some significant fraction of new cars that are being bought at the moment, and people are buying those cars on the presumption that there isn't a tax on driving them, and if the government tried to introduce one, there would be probably all hell to pay in terms of the kickback on that, just as there has been with attempts to cut spending on disability benefits, just as there has been cut spending on pensions, and as I'm sure there will be, whatever tax increases it is that the Chancellor tries to put in place either later this year or some years down the road. And this is where I think the work that we at IFS do about what looks like a fiscal necessity, shall we say, butts right up against political reality. And I think one of the things I've not worked out in the 14 and a half years that I've been director is how we translate our analysis in a way that is helpful to politicians in, as it were, making the case to the country that if you want lower taxes, then you're going to have to accept some of these decisions on spending. And if you want more money for the health service and defence and so on, you're going to have to accept some of these choices on tax. So, Helen, I mean,
game on. I hear the challenge.
Absolutely. have you got some ideas about how to do that?
I think obviously these things are hard, but I think there's a bit of a danger that politicians hear, it's hard, and then they feel like they don't do anything, and that's the rubbish response. So my view, and obviously I'm not a politician, and I'm not trying to get elected, but I think what we haven't tried, I think we could try, is actually explaining, not we IFS, the politicians and the public, explaining a good end vision. And then thinking about how do you work towards that. I think a lot of the problems we've seen is when politicians do things that look like they're in isolation and targeted at special groups. So winter fuel payments, what happened there? Pensioners felt targeted. IHT on farmers, what happened there? Farmers felt targeted. The recent welfare reforms, disabled people felt targeted. And it all felt very specific and very targeted at a specific group. And there was no real sense of what's the sunny uplands here? What's the vision? So if instead, and this is kind of what we do at IFS in some sense, it's what would a good tax system look like? What would it deliver for lots of people? Why would having a tax system that didn't stop you moving house or didn't have horrible effects on work incentives or investments, what would that give to us as a country? And we can all buy into that wouldn't that be great? I think if you win that argument, then you can start to say, okay, we got to get there. Let's start. And just to take, you could take any example of this, but take the driving one. Obviously, if you slap a whacking great tax on a car that you thought had zero tax in it overnight, you're going to upset people. What you could absolutely do is say, over the next 10 years, we're going to introduce a tax that's £5 today. It's going to become some number in 10 years' time. It's a very clear path. And everyone knows that path, and it becomes the normal. And on day one, it's not so bad, actually, and it's part of some bigger vision. And you feel like it's being done for a reason that's good for the country, and not just I scrabbled around the back of the Treasury sofa, and it was all a bit difficult, and you guys were the ones that were going to scream least, or I could find some money here, I'm doing that. So I think we shouldn't be too it's difficult. Of course, life's difficult. We still keep living, right? So I think getting to the moon was difficult. We got to the moon. So I think we shouldn't be too much it's difficult, therefore don't bother. I think we should explain to people and get politicians to explain what is their big vision? What is the government's vision for how we should tax income in general and as people age? So they've shoved up taxes on employment income. Well, is that a good thing to be doing if you want more employment, and if people are aging and you have maybe want taxes on more people who are in their not working life? So, what's the vision of where we're trying to get to? I think if you had that, then people might see a step as something towards something better, rather than what honestly I think maybe feels like, and really in reality probably is, you're going budget to budget, and it's not a well-reasoned should we do? It's a what can we get away with? So I'm actually much more optimistic about the public. I think the public are actually pretty smart and sensible. And if we had these honest conversations about what are the choices we face, what could we achieve, and how do we get there, I think the politicians underestimate people. I think we could have a much better dialogue.
I completely agree with that, and I think that's and you can see periods in recent history where at least to a degree. That has happened. If you look back in the early 2000s, there was an increase in national insurance contributions, supposedly to increase spending on the National Health Service. It was a broad-based tax. There was quite a strong narrative about that. You look at the austerity years of 2010 onwards, the Conservatives really sold a hard message that we need to do this, rightly or wrongly, and people voted for them, and they voted for them again in 2015. If you look back at some tax changes over the 80s and 90s, we got rid of tax relief on mortgage interest, which looked really difficult at the time. It was done gradually over a period of time in a way that people were able to swallow. And I think that has been a problem with governments, actually. All the governments since 2016, but including the current one, is that they haven't produced that sort of narrative, that vision, that sense of direction. And my goodness, and it goes back much longer than that. Budget by budget by budget, it is obvious that chancellors and officials are just kind of basically starting from scratch every time. And you can see it with the yo-yoing and the circling that you get in tax policy, up, down, and round and round and round. And what was the problem about winter fuel payments that Rachel Reeves had? Well, she should be blaming Gordon Brown, because this was introduced as a sop to pensioners sort of back in 2000. And you can think of all of these things that that politicians layer in for good, which become permanent features of the tax system or permanent features of the spending system, that's been very hard to undo because they're doing it exactly as you say, on a sort of, this is what looks like a good idea today, not part of a longer term plan for what they should be looking to achieve.
Another example, I mean, I have endless examples like this, but just one that pops to my mind.
Keep going.
Is happened in my time, that the government introduced the withdrawal of the personal allowance. So you hit £100,000 and you withdraw the personal allowance. So that basically means there's this odd kind of bump in the tax schedule where for a band of income you get a 60% tax rate. Stupid. You're not going to write down any economic model of the world that gives you a tax schedule that looks like that. It was just done as a way of, we need to tax rich people more, we think, and we want to do it in a way that's not just putting up the rate, and therefore let's do this thing. But could you get rid of it now? Well, if you got rid of it now, a big problem that the government would have, or they would see as having, is that it would be a really big giveaway to really rich people. You have a distributional chart.
They're much less rich people than they were, because that 100,000 limit has been stayed in cash terms 100,000 for something like 15 years now, and then we've got very, very many more people affected.
Yeah, absolutely. But it would still be in a distributional chart. It would be the top 10%,
the top 10%
who were being better off. And now it's become a political, you can't touch it, because no one wants to do the thing that is the big tax giveaway to those people. So it's exactly one of those things you're mentioning, where it got put in place for what felt like actually a pretty short term, we've got to do something, we can't do something else, we'll just shove this thing in. And now it's just become a seemingly, thing we can't get out of our tax system because it's just stuck in there. And there are just endless examples like that.
There's so many of them. I mean, why have we got a 20% basic rate of income tax? Because for decades, chancellors thought, here is a way of getting a little bit of political advantage by chopping a penny or two or three off the basic rate of income tax. It's now it was 35% in the mid 1970s. It came down to 30, and then it came down to 25, and it's come down to 20, and that's obviously great in the sense that you're paying less tax, but it's impossible to put it up again, and so we're layering all, and that's a huge cost in terms of income to the government. So they're having to find all sorts of other ways of raising tax in ways that actually are probably less, or definitely less efficient, and probably no better from a distributional point of view as well.
Yeah. So government needs a vision, and I mean, we wrote a big book about that, right? I mean, one of the first things you did.
We did,
on tax,
yes,
yeah, exactly.
Yes.
One of the first things you did as director. So they haven't even got to start from scratch. There's a ready-made vision.
Excellent.
But at least I really I think people should demand of their politicians a vision. I think we shouldn't just ask. I mean, I'm actually getting increasingly grumpy about, and it's going to happen all summer. Given that Rachel Reed says she won't do X, Y, and Z, what could she do in the budget to raise this amount of money? And I just think that's a really dull exam question. Yes, I know the answer to it, and it's hard. And here are the list of small taxes you could tweak. But why does anyone think that's a good question to be? Why aren't we asking, if the government raises £1 trillion, here is a shopping list full of things they do that are really silly and bad for growth and fairness. Why aren't they changing that? Or what is the best way to raise extra money, or to raise the current amount of money in a better way? They're really important questions. I mean, really, how you scrape another £5 billion out of a tax system that raises over $1 trillion, it's just hard to get excited about that in the broader picture.
Well, I think we're going to have to start drawing this to an end. I think it's a brilliant place at which to draw it. I mean, you're absolutely right. We need a sense of direction, both for how we're going to achieve growth, but also where we want the public finances to go, and specifically in what we've been talking about, how we want the tax system to progress. And we have lacked that for a very, very long period of time. And I think the way you put it, Helen, was brilliant. That sort of, if it feels to groups that they're being picked on because they're easy pickings, rather than that the way that winter fuel payment is changing or disability benefit is changing or what have you, it's part of a bigger vision and plan which is affecting everybody, then they're going to be much harder to achieve. I mean, we saw it under the coalition government. They had no problem, in a sense, putting up VAT from 17.5% to 20%, which is a huge tax rise.
But not pasties.
Yes, try and put tax on pasties, and then the pasty eaters of the world go bonkers.
Yeah.
And so it's a repeated problem. So good luck to you, Helen, in terms of selling that vision in a way that I've clearly failed to do over the last 15 years to politicians. And let's hope that over your tenure, the tax system actually gets better rather than, I think, on the whole, getting worse as it has done under mine.
But the worry about that is that it really could get worse.
We were so upbeat.
No.
We were so upbeat.
Game on. Mission accepted.
Well, it's a really sad moment for me. I'm signing off now as host of the IFS Zooms In. I think we're a great double act here. I think we should do this again. But Helen, you don't need it, but best of luck. As you know, you're taking over a fantastic organisation and a fantastic podcast. And thank you to everyone who's been listening to us chatting away here on the IFS Zooms In. Do continue to tune in to Helen, talking about all sorts of things fiscal into the future, which I will now, instead of hosting, I'll be listening to assiduously over the coming months and years. And if you enjoyed this episode, do subscribe in your podcast app and share it with anyone who might be interested. If you'd like to support our work, you can become a member for as little as £10 a month. Just check the link in the episode description. Thanks for listening, and Helen, we'll see you next time.